The sun bled into the horizon, painting the Arizona sky in hues of burnt orange and deep purple. But Thomas Sterling, his face a roadmap of hard labor and recent sorrow, saw none of its beauty. He sat on the porch of his ranch house, the wood creaking under his weary frame. The land around him, once a source of pride, now felt like a cage. His cattle were thinning, the fields were dry, and a suffocating silence had replaced the lively chaos of a working ranch. Inside, his son Ethan lay in a bed that was a prison of blankets and despair. A month ago, a falling wagon wheel had crushed his leg. The local doctor, a man more comfortable with splinters than shattered bones, had declared the boy would never walk again. Those words had been a death sentence, not just for Ethan's legs, but for Thomas's heart. He'd sold his best horse, his wife's silver locket, anything he could to scrape together money for a new doctor, a better cure. But no one came. They heard the story, saw the small town on the map and dismissed it. Now he was down to his last $2, a measly sum, a final, desperate plea. He rose, his joints protesting with every movement, and walked into town. The dirt main street was quiet, the usual hum of business replaced by an oppressive stillness. He found the town's only notice board, a splintered piece of wood next to the general store. With a shaky hand, he pinned a small, handwritten note. The ink was smudged, the words a raw cry for help. $2. My son must walk again, it read. He needs help. I'll pay for a chance. Thomas stepped back, his throat tight. He wasn't a praying man, not anymore. But as he looked at the notice, a silent plea formed in his mind, a desperate hope against all logic. He watched as townsfolk passed, their eyes lingering on the sign, then quickly moving on, a mix of pity and discomfort on their faces. They knew the Sterling family. They'd seen the hope drain from Thomas's eyes and the light dim in young Ethan's. They had nothing to offer. A lone rider approached, a man Thomas had never seen before. He was lean, with a weathered face that told stories of long roads and hard times. His clothes were dusty, his boots worn, but he carried himself with a quiet authority. He dismounted and walked to the notice board, his gaze fixed on Thomas's desperate words. He didn't pity, didn't look away. He just stared. Thomas felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in weeks, a spark of defiance. This stranger, this drifter, couldn't possibly help. He was probably just looking for a free meal. But as the man turned, his eyes met Thomas's. They were a piercing blue, holding a depth of knowledge and a hint of a pain that mirrored his own. "You're Thomas Sterling?" the man asked, his voice low and steady. Thomas nodded, a lump in his throat. "I'm Caleb Thorne," the man said, a faint shadow passing over his face. He gestured to the note. "I saw your ad. I'm not a doctor, not anymore anyway." Thomas's shoulders slumped. He'd known it. The $2 in his pocket felt heavier, a testament to his foolish hope. "But I was," Caleb continued, "a long time ago. Army surgeon." Thomas's head snapped up. An army surgeon? They were healers of the impossible, mending shattered men on battlefields. The words felt like water in a desert. "What do you want?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with suspicion. Caleb's gaze was direct. "I want to see the boy. That's all. If I can't help, you can keep your $2. The offer was simple, almost too simple. Thomas hesitated. The man could be a con artist, a huckster looking to exploit his pain. But what else did he have to lose? He'd already lost everything that mattered. "All right," Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper. "Follow me." As they walked back to the ranch, Thomas felt a strange mix of apprehension and the faintest flicker of hope. He was a rancher who dealt in cattle and land, not faith. But with $2 and a desperate plea, he had hired a stranger. And somewhere, deep inside, he wondered if he had just hired the impossible. Caleb Thorne followed Thomas Sterling in silence, his horse's hooves kicking up dust on the worn path. He observed the rancher, a man whose spine was ramrod straight, but whose shoulders carried the weight of the world. The ranch itself was a testament to struggle. Fences were in disrepair, and the few head of cattle looked gaunt. This wasn't just a physical hardship. It was a psychological one, etched into the landscape. When they arrived at the house, a small, weathered woman with kind eyes met them at the door. Sarah Sterling, Thomas's wife. Her face was pale, but her resolve was as strong as her husband's. She glanced from Thomas to Caleb, her expression a mix of weary hope and deep-seated skepticism. The Sterling family had been disappointed too many times. "Sarah, this is Caleb Thorne," Thomas said, his voice flat. He was an army surgeon. He's going to look at Ethan." Sarah's eyes widened for a moment, then she nodded slowly. "Come in, Mr. Thorne." Caleb stepped inside, the air of the house thick with the scent of sickness and old dust. The interior was simple but tidy, a testament to Sarah's efforts to maintain some semblance of normalcy. He was led to a small bedroom where the boy, Ethan, lay propped up with pillows. The boy's face was thin, his skin pale, but his eyes were wide and remarkably bright. They held a deep intelligence and a fear that was difficult to witness. Caleb approached the bed and knelt, not as a doctor, but as a man. He didn't grab at the boy's leg, didn't make demands. He simply looked at him, his gaze soft. "Hello, Ethan," Caleb said. "My name's Caleb. Your dad said you need a hand." Ethan's eyes, so full of questions, looked to his father. Thomas gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "They say I won't walk again," Ethan whispered, his voice thin and shaky. "They say a lot of things," Caleb replied. He gently placed a hand on the boy's uninjured leg, then moved to the one encased in a crude, homemade splint. He asked quiet questions, not about the pain, but about the accident, how it happened, what the boy remembered. Thomas and Sarah watched, their tension a palpable force in the small room. Caleb's hands were surprisingly gentle as he carefully unwrapped the bandages. Beneath, the skin was discolored and swollen. It was a bad break, a complex fracture that had healed poorly. The bone was misaligned, causing pressure on the nerves. A modern surgeon would have operated, but here, in the middle of nowhere, the only option had been to set it as best they could and hope. The local doctor's best had not been good enough. Thomas tensed, expecting Caleb to deliver the same grim prognosis, but Caleb didn't speak. He simply felt the limb, his fingers tracing the contours of the bone with a practiced touch. Thomas watched, mesmerized by the quiet focus. He saw not a charlatan but a man who understood something profound about the human body. "The bone's set wrong," Caleb said at last, his voice low. "It's pressing on the nerve. That's why he can't feel his foot." Thomas's heart sank. He knew that. The doctor had said as much, with a shrug of finality. "But it's not hopeless," Caleb added, and the words hung in the air like a miracle. Thomas and Sarah looked at each other, their faces etched with a cautious, fragile hope. Caleb looked at Thomas. "I can help him, but it'll be a long road, and it'll require more than just my knowledge. It'll require trust, from you, from Sarah, and from Ethan." He stood up, his gaze sweeping over the family. "I'll need to reset the bone, not with a knife. Not here. It'll take time. We'll need to use pressure, massage, and build strength. The muscles have atrophied. It's a slow process." Thomas, a man of action and immediacy, felt his old suspicion resurface. "Slow? How slow?" "A year. Maybe more," Caleb said. Thomas scoffed. "A year? I can't afford to pay you for a year." "I'm not asking for a year's pay," Caleb replied, his voice firm. "I'm asking for a place to stay and a meal. You can keep your $2. We can settle up when Ethan walks again." The offer was so absurdly generous that it made Thomas's head spin. Who was this man? What did he want? "Why?" Thomas demanded. "Why would you do this?" Caleb's gaze was distant, as if he were looking at something far away, something in his past. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Thomas. Even a boy who can't walk. Even a man who's lost his way." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Thomas saw the shadow in his eyes, the unspoken pain that drove this solitary man. He was running from something, or toward something, and the Sterling family had just become part of his journey. Thomas felt the weight of the decision on his shoulders. A year of trusting a stranger, a year of hope, a year of risk. He looked at his son, at the small, hopeful smile that had appeared on Ethan's face. He looked at Sarah, whose eyes pleaded with him to say yes. Thomas took a deep breath. "All right, Caleb. You have a deal." The first weeks of Caleb's stay at the Sterling Ranch were an exercise in cautious cohabitation. Thomas, a man who measured trust in hard work and shared history, found himself constantly testing Caleb. He watched as the ex-surgeon spent his days not with a medical bag, but with a hammer and nails mending the fences. He saw him not with a scalpel, but with a shovel, helping to clear the irrigation ditches. Caleb worked with a quiet, efficient rhythm, never complaining, never asking for more than what was offered. The most profound change, however, was in the house. Caleb's presence brought a quiet, focused energy. He spent hours with Ethan, not just working on his leg, but talking to him. He told stories of the army, of distant places, of strange people he had met. He taught the boy to play checkers and to whittle small figures from wood. For the first time since the accident, Ethan's laugh echoed through the house. The physical therapy was slow and painful. Caleb used a series of gentle stretches and massages, working to loosen the atrophied muscles and realign the bone. Ethan would cry out sometimes, his small face contorted in pain. Thomas, watching from the doorway, would have to clench his fists to keep from intervening. But Caleb would always pause, his voice calm and reassuring, telling Ethan it was a good pain, a pain of healing. One afternoon, as Thomas and Caleb were fixing a sagging barn door, a rider approached. It was a well-dressed man on a sleek, black horse. His name was Silas Vance, a land baron who was slowly but surely consolidating all the land in the valley. He had a reputation for buying ranches cheap and driving out those who wouldn't sell. He was a man with a smile that never reached his eyes and a handshake that felt like a threat. Silas dismounted, his expensive leather boots sinking into the dust. He looked around the run-down ranch with a sneer. "Thomas! Good to see you're still trying to hold on." "Vance," Thomas replied, his voice flat. He introduced Caleb, and Vance's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't offer a handshake, just a cold, appraising look. "I heard about your boy, Thomas. Shame. That kind of thing saps the life out of a man, doesn't it? The ranch, too." Silas gestured with a gloved hand. "I'm here to make you a final offer. I'll give you a fair price for the land. You can take your family and go somewhere with better doctors, better opportunities." The offer was an insult. The price was laughably low, barely enough to cover Thomas's debts, let alone relocate his family. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations, Silas," Thomas said, his grip tightening on his hammer. "It's not for sale." Silas's smile widened, but it held no warmth. "A man can only hold on for so long, Thomas. The taxes are due next month. I'd hate to see you lose everything to the county." He was a master of veiled threats. He knew exactly where to press, a predator circling a wounded prey. Thomas felt the rage boil in his gut. He knew Vance was behind the recent cattle disappearances and the sabotage of his irrigation ditch. He just couldn't prove it. Caleb stepped forward, his voice calm and level. "Mr. Vance, the Sterling family is not interested in selling. I suggest you turn around and leave." Silas's eyes, full of casual menace, landed on Caleb. He saw a drifter, a hired hand. "And who are you, friend?" "A man who thinks he can tell me what to do on someone else's property." "I'm a guest here," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave. "And a friend. The family has enough to deal with without you adding to their troubles." Silas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "A friend, is it? We'll see how long that lasts when you realize what kind of troubles they're in. Good luck, Thomas. I'll be back." Silas mounted his horse and rode off, the sound of his hooves a drumbeat of future conflict. Thomas stood, fuming, his hands trembling. He looked at Caleb, who simply watched the dust settle. "He's a snake," Thomas said, the words a bitter hiss. "He'll find a way to take this place." "He will," Caleb agreed. unless we find a way to stop him, one step at a time. The first step is to get your son on his feet. The second is to get this ranch back on its own." Thomas looked at the ranch, at the fields and the barn, and then at Caleb. This stranger was not just a healer, he was a silent ally. And Thomas, the proud rancher who had faced his battles alone, realized he was no longer fighting on his own. The threat of Silas Vance hung in the air like a storm cloud, but it also served to galvanize the Sterling household. Thomas, fueled by a renewed sense of purpose, worked harder than ever. Sarah, with a new lightness in her step, devoted herself to the daily chores with a vigor she hadn't felt in months. And Ethan, inspired by Caleb's quiet strength, pushed through the pain of his physical therapy with a newfound determination. Caleb's days were a blend of ranch work and medical care. In the mornings, he and Thomas would ride out to check on the cattle or work the fields. They rarely spoke, communicating with nods and a shared understanding of the tasks at hand. Thomas began to notice the details, the way Caleb could spot a sick calf from a distance, the way he could fix a faulty piece of equipment with a calm efficiency. He wasn't just a hired hand, he was a partner. In the afternoons, Caleb was back in the house, tending to Ethan. The exercises were getting more intense, but the results were undeniable. The swelling in the boy's leg had gone down, and a glimmer of sensation had returned. Ethan could feel a light touch on his foot, a small but monumental victory that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. One evening, after a long day's work, Thomas and Caleb sat on the porch, watching the stars ignite the night sky. Thomas had a bottle of whiskey, a rare indulgence. He poured 2 glasses. "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice low and a little rough, "for what you're doing for my boy." Caleb took a slow sip of the whiskey. "He's a good boy, Thomas. He's a fighter." "He gets it from his mother," Thomas said with a small smile. "She's tougher than me." Silence settled between them, a comfortable quiet that had replaced the initial tension. "You're a good man, Thomas," Caleb said suddenly. "You gave up your last $2 to save your son. Not many men would do that." "You didn't take it," Thomas pointed out. Caleb looked into his glass. "I've seen men die for less. $2, 2 cents. It doesn't matter. What matters is what a man is willing to give. You gave everything you had. That's enough." Thomas wanted to ask about Caleb's past, about the shadows in his eyes. What had happened to make a man like him wander the land with no home, no family? But the words got stuck in his throat. He sensed that Caleb would tell him when he was ready. As if reading his mind, Caleb spoke. "The war, it changes a man. I saw things, did things, saw men broken and couldn't fix them, saw things I didn't want to see." He paused, the memory of physical weight on his shoulders. "When it was over, I couldn't go back to what I was before, so I started walking, just kept moving, until I saw that note you put up." Thomas finally understood. Caleb was broken too, not physically, but inside. He had come to the Sterling Ranch not just to heal a boy, but to try and heal himself. It was a trade, an unspoken pact. "We all have our demons, Caleb," Thomas said, his gaze fixed on the stars. "Some are bigger than others," Caleb replied, a hint of a sad smile on his lips, "but we face them all the same." They finished their whiskey in companionable silence. The bond between them had deepened. It was no longer a business arrangement, but a friendship forged in desperation and shared hardship. Thomas had hired a stranger, and in return he had found an ally and a friend. The future was still uncertain, and the shadow of Silas Vance was still looming, but for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt a sense of hope. He wasn't fighting for his family and his ranch alone anymore. He had someone in his corner. The morning air was crisp and cool, a welcome change after the oppressive heat of the past few days. Thomas and Caleb were up before the sun, heading out to check the irrigation lines. The dry spell was taking its toll, and they needed every drop of water they could get to save the crops. As they rode closer to the main water source, a cold knot of dread formed in Thomas's stomach. The main sluice gate, which controlled the flow of water to his fields, was wide open, and water was pouring uselessly into the dry creek bed. The water level in the main reservoir was already dangerously low. Thomas dismounted, his face a mask of fury. "Damn him! Vance! He did this!" Caleb walked to the gate, examining the heavy iron mechanism. "This wasn't an accident, Thomas. The pins were cut. Cleanly. Someone knew what they were doing." The rage in Thomas's gut was a physical thing. This wasn't just a nuisance. It was a deliberate act of sabotage, an attempt to cripple his livelihood. The crops, a lifeline for his family, would wither and die without water. He looked at the vast, dry fields stretching out before him, the vision of ruin a stark reality. "He said he'd be back," Thomas said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "This is him making good on his promise?" "We need to fix this now," Caleb said, his tone urgent but calm. "We can build a temporary dam to divert the water back. It'll be tough, but we can do it." They worked relentlessly, their hands tearing, their muscles screaming in protest. They used a combination of rocks, mud, and fallen logs to create a makeshift barrier. The sun rose higher in the sky, beating down on them, but they didn't stop. They worked in a shared, silent determination, a partnership forged in crisis. Thomas felt his rage transform into a quiet resolve. Silas Vance was trying to break him, but he wouldn't. Not as long as he had Caleb and his family fighting alongside him. By midday, they had managed to divert a small stream of water back into the irrigation ditches. It wasn't enough to save the entire harvest, but it was enough to save some. They returned to the ranch, their bodies exhausted, their clothes caked in mud. Sarah met them at the door, her face a question. Thomas didn't need to say a word. The mud and the weariness told the story. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of the day's events. Ethan, who had overheard the talk of sabotage, looked at his father with concern. "Is everything okay, Pa?" he asked, his voice small. "Everything is fine, son," Thomas said, though the lie felt like ashes in his mouth. "He's just trying to break us, Ethan," Caleb said, his voice steady. "But your father's a hard man to break. And so is this family." Ethan looked at Caleb, then at his father. He understood. He had witnessed the change in his father since Caleb's arrival, a slow return of a man who had lost his purpose. The day's hardship, rather than a defeat, had become a testament to their resilience. Later, as Thomas lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. He thought about Silas Vance, about the systematic way he was trying to destroy his life. He also thought about Caleb, a man who had every reason to walk away but chose to stay and fight. He realized something profound. Thomas had always been a solitary fighter, believing that a man had to stand alone to protect what was his. But the world was changing. The threats were bigger, more insidious. He couldn't fight them with just a hammer and a shovel. He needed allies, a community, and he had found one, in the most unlikely of places, a drifter with a shadowed past. A few days after the sabotage, a new rider approached the Sterling Ranch. This time, it was a man Thomas recognized, Dr. Henry, the town's only physician. Dr. Henry was a stern, humorless man who had delivered the grim news about Ethan's leg. He was a practitioner of a rigid, traditional form of medicine and had a deep-seated distrust of anything that deviated from his narrow view of healing. Dr. Henry dismounted, his face a mix of curiosity and professional indignation. He had heard rumors about a wandering healer at the Sterling Ranch and had come to see for himself. "Thomas," he said, his voice clipped, "I heard you hired some charlatan to work on your boy." Thomas bristled. "Caleb is not a charlatan, Henry. He's a good man, and a good healer." Dr. Henry scoffed. "I saw the boy's injury, Thomas. I told you there's nothing that can be done. This man you hired is a fraud, and he's giving your son false hope. It's cruel." Caleb emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw Dr. Henry, and a subtle tension entered his posture. He recognized the type, a man of the books, of rigid rules, who feared what he couldn't understand. "Dr. Henry," Caleb said, his voice calm, "I believe in giving people a chance." "A chance at what?" Henry demanded, his voice rising. "A chance to be disappointed? That bone is set wrong. It will never heal correctly. You're just delaying the inevitable." "The bone is set wrong, I agree," Caleb said, his eyes steady. "But the body is an incredible thing, Doctor. It can adapt. It can overcome. We're working with Ethan's body, not against it. We're strengthening the muscles, realigning the bone with gentle pressure, not breaking it again with brute force." Henry's face flushed with anger. "That is unscientific nonsense. You are not a licensed physician. You are a danger to this family. I insist you leave, Thomas, for your son's own good." Thomas, feeling the old familiar rage bubbling up, stepped between them. "He's staying, Henry. My son is happier and healthier than he's been in months. You came here to tell me what I already knew. You offered no hope. Caleb did. And that's a real thing, a tangible thing that has changed my son's life. Now you've said your piece. It's time for you to go." Dr. Henry looked from Thomas's defiant face to Caleb's calm, resolute one. He saw a bond, a shared purpose that he couldn't break. With a final, frustrated huff, he turned and mounted his horse, a defeated man. He rode off, his shadow disappearing into the dusty horizon. As the silence returned, Thomas turned to Caleb. "You didn't have to defend yourself. I had it handled." "I know," Caleb said, a small wry smile on his lips. "But sometimes a man needs to know he's not fighting alone." The encounter, while unpleasant, served a purpose. It solidified Thomas's trust in Caleb. He was no longer just a hired hand, but a man who had a true belief in his work and a quiet strength that could withstand the accusations of the world. It also underscored the growing isolation of the Sterling family. With Silas Vance on one side and Dr. Henry on the other, they were an island, and Caleb was their only anchor. The rest of the afternoon was spent in a new routine. Ethan was now trying to stand, with the help of Caleb's gentle support. It was a slow, agonizing process, but with each wobbly attempt, Thomas saw the glimmers of a future that had once seemed impossible. The bond between the three of them, father, son, and the wandering healer, was becoming unbreakable. The news of Dr. Henry's visit and his angry departure from the Sterling Ranch spread through the town like wildfire. Rumors flew. Some said Caleb Thorne was a fraud, a criminal pretending to be a doctor. Others, who had seen the change in Thomas and Ethan, whispered that he was a miracle worker. The town was divided, and Thomas and his family found themselves at the center of a storm of gossip and judgment. When Thomas went into town for supplies, he felt the stares. People who had once offered him pity now gave him looks of cold disapproval. The general store owner, a man named Mr. Peterson, who had been a friend for years, was distant and cool. "Thomas," he said, his voice low, "I heard you've been taking advice from that fella. Folks are saying he's no good, that he's just taking advantage of you and your family." "He's helping my son, Peterson," Thomas said, his patience wearing thin. "Maybe," Peterson said, his eyes filled with doubt. "But you're a proud man, Thomas. Don't let a snake convince you to trade your dignity for a little false hope." Thomas paid for his supplies in silence and left the store. He felt a deep sense of betrayal. These were the people he had grown up with, the people he had shared harvests and hardships with. Now they were siding with a man who offered only doubt against a man who offered a glimmer of a future. The isolation was painful. Thomas had always been a private man, but he had never felt truly alone until now. He returned to the ranch with a heavy heart, the simple act of buying supplies now a gauntlet of whispered judgments. Caleb, ever perceptive, noticed the change in Thomas's demeanor. He didn't press. He simply offered a quiet word of support. "Don't let them get to you, Thomas. People are afraid of what they don't understand. They'd rather see a man defeated in a way they can explain than to see him find hope in a way they can't." The incident strengthened the resolve of the Sterling family. They were no longer fighting just for the ranch and for Ethan's legs. They were fighting for their belief in something different, something better than the grim certainty that the town had offered them. Meanwhile, Caleb's relationship with Ethan deepened. The boy, who had once been timid and withdrawn, now had a fierce spirit. He worked tirelessly at his exercises, fueled by Caleb's stories and encouragement. He was still weak, still had a long way to go, but the light in his eyes was undeniable. The physical progress was slow, but the emotional and psychological transformation was rapid and profound. Ethan wasn't just healing his body, he was rebuilding his spirit. One evening, as Caleb was sitting by the fire, whittling a small wooden horse for Ethan, Sarah came and sat beside him. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, "for not just what you're doing for Ethan, but for what you're doing for Thomas. He's not the man he was. He's better. He has hope again." Caleb looked at the small wooden horse in his hands. "He's a good man, Sarah. He just needed a little help. We all do sometimes." The small act of kindness, the carved horse, the whispered words of thanks, was a quiet victory. They were facing down not just a land baron and a self-righteous doctor, but a whole town's worth of doubt. And they were winning, one small act of faith at a time. The story wasn't just about a boy learning to walk. It was about a family learning to stand tall against the world. Silas Vance was not a patient man. The news of Dr. Henry's failed attempt to turn the town against Thomas Sterling only fueled his anger. He saw Caleb Thorne not as a healer, but as a fly in the ointment, a nuisance that was getting in the way of his land grab. He decided it was time to change tactics. He rode out to the Sterling Ranch again, but this time he came alone. He found Thomas in the barn, mending a saddle. He dismounted, a cold smile on his face. "Thomas," he said, his voice a low, silky threat, "I'm here to make you one last offer, a different kind of offer." Thomas didn't stop working. "I told you, Silas, this land isn't for sale." "I'm not talking about the land anymore," Silas said. "I'm talking about your boy. I'm a man of influence, Thomas. I know people. Doctors, real doctors in California, men who could do what this hobo can't. I could get Ethan the best care money can buy, a chance to walk again, for real." Thomas's hands stilled. The offer was a masterstroke of manipulation. It hit him where he was most vulnerable, not with a threat of ruin, but with the false promise of salvation. He knew what Silas was doing. He was dangling the one thing Thomas wanted more than anything in the world. "What's the price, Silas?" Thomas asked, his voice low. He didn't need to ask, but he needed to hear the words. "The ranch," Silas said, his eyes glittering with triumph. "Sign the papers and I'll have a wagon here to take your boy to California. I'll pay for everything, his care, his lodging, everything. All you have to do is let this place go. It's what's best for him, Thomas. You know it is." Thomas looked at the worn saddle in his hands. He thought of all the hard work he had poured into this land, all the sweat and blood. But more than that, he thought of Ethan. He thought of the long, painful road ahead, the slow progress, the fear that Caleb's methods might fail. This was an easy way out, a path to a real professional cure. But he also thought of Caleb. He thought of the man's quiet strength, his unwavering belief in the impossible. He thought of the trust that had grown between them, the bond that had been forged in shared adversity. He had promised Caleb that they would get through this together. He had trusted him with his son's future. Thomas looked at Silas, the cold calculation in the man's eyes. He saw not a savior but a parasite, a man who would use his son's pain to get what he wanted. "You're a snake, Silas," Thomas said, his voice flat. "You'd use a sick child to get what you want." "I'm a businessman, Thomas," Silas said, his smile tight, "and I'm offering you a chance to do what's right for your family. A real chance, not some wild-eyed hope from a wandering stranger." Just then, Caleb appeared at the barn door, his hands dirty from working on a wagon wheel. He saw the tension in the air, the desperate look on Thomas's face, and the predatory smirk on Silas Vance's. "Mr. Vance," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. "I suggest you leave. Your offer has been heard, and it has been refused." Silas's smirk faltered. He looked at Caleb, at the quiet resolve in his eyes. He saw a man who wasn't just a hired hand, but a true protector. He had miscalculated. He had thought he was dealing with a desperate, broken man. He hadn't counted on the strength of the bond between them. "You're making a mistake, Thomas," Silas said, his voice losing its silken edge and turning to a cold threat. "You'll regret this." He mounted his horse and rode away, defeated for the second time. Thomas watched him go, then turned to Caleb. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes was a silent "thank you." He had almost wavered, almost broken, but Caleb had been there to remind him of what was real, of what truly mattered. The confrontation with Silas Vance had a profound effect on the Sterling Ranch. The threat was no longer abstract. It was personal and malicious. Thomas and Caleb worked with a renewed sense of urgency, knowing that time was running out. They had to get the ranch back on its feet, and they had to get Ethan walking again before Silas found a new way to break them. The physical therapy for Ethan became more intense. Caleb had built a series of simple wooden crutches, and they began the arduous process of teaching Ethan to use them. It was slow going. The boy's muscles were weak, and the pain was constant. There were moments of frustration, moments when Ethan would cry out and want to give up. But Thomas and Caleb were always there, one on each side, their hands steady, their voices encouraging. One afternoon, as a late afternoon storm gathered on the horizon, a small miracle occurred. Ethan, propped up with the crutches, his face a mask of concentration, took a step. It was a small step, a wobbly movement of his foot, but it was a step. Thomas, watching from the doorway, felt a rush of emotion that almost brought him to his knees. Sarah, her hands covering her mouth, let out a small sob of pure joy. "Again, son," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Do it again." Ethan, his face flushed with triumph, took another wobbly step, and then another. It wasn't a walk. It was a shuffle, a limping, painful advance, but it was movement. It was progress. It was hope. Caleb stood back, a rare, genuine smile on his face. He watched the family, not as a doctor, but as a man who had found a purpose. He had come to the ranch to escape his past, and in doing so, he had found a new future. The sound of the crutches on the wooden floor was a drumbeat of triumph. It was a sound that Silas Vance would never hear, a sound that Dr. Henry would never believe. It was the sound of the impossible happening. That evening, as they gathered for dinner, the mood was one of quiet celebration. The storm raged outside, but inside, the Sterling house was filled with a warm, hopeful light. Ethan, tired but jubilant, was propped up at the table, a plate of food in front of him. "He took his first steps today," Sarah said to Caleb, her voice still filled with wonder. Caleb simply nodded. He didn't take the credit. He knew the victory was Ethan's. Thomas looked at his son, his heart full. He had spent months in a fog of despair, convinced that his son's future was one of a lifetime in a chair. But now, as he watched Ethan laugh and talk, he saw a different future. A future of walking, of running, of a life he had thought was lost forever. He looked at Caleb, the quiet man who had entered their lives and changed them forever. He had given up his last $2 for a chance, and he had received something more valuable than any amount of money. He had received hope, and that was a treasure more precious than all the gold in the world. The chapter closes with Ethan attempting to take one more step, his crutches scraping on the floor, the sound a promise of all that was to come. The storm outside rages, but it is no match for the storm of human resilience inside the small ranch house. The family, a new member among them, is stronger than ever. The road ahead is long, but for the first time in a long time, they are looking forward to the journey. The first successful steps had ignited a fire in the Sterling family, but the triumph was short-lived. A new threat, more direct and immediate than Silas Vance's legal maneuvering, appeared on the horizon. The ranch's dwindling cattle herd, their last real asset, began to disappear, not one or two at a time, but in significant numbers, leaving only the tracks of horses that weren't their own and the scent of human greed in the dust. Thomas was furious. This wasn't a random act. It was calculated, a clear message from Silas Vance. He was trying to bleed them dry, to make them so desperate they would sign away their land for a handful of coins. Thomas and Caleb rode the range for days, tracking the thieves. The trail was difficult to follow, expertly obscured by men who knew what they were doing. "He's not just using his own men," Caleb said, examining a hoof print near a dried-up creek bed. "He's hired professional rustlers. He's not leaving anything to chance." Thomas's face was a mask of cold fury. "He thinks he's so smart. He thinks he can just take what he wants." Their search led them to a hidden canyon a few miles from the Sterling property, a narrow cut in the rock face that was a perfect spot to hold a small herd. As they approached, they saw the glint of steel and the forms of 3 men on horseback. They were moving the remaining cattle out of the canyon, pushing them toward Vance's land. Thomas reached for his rifle. "They're not getting away with it." "Wait," Caleb said, his hand on Thomas's arm. 3 against 2. It's a suicide mission, and even if we win, they'll just be replaced. We need to hit him where it hurts. The law might be on Vance's payroll, but the town is starting to see what kind of man he is." Thomas hesitated, his hand still on the rifle. He wanted to charge in, to fight, to prove that he wouldn't be broken. But Caleb was right. This wasn't just a physical fight. It was a battle for their livelihood and their future. They returned to the ranch, defeated but not broken. The sight of their few remaining cattle was a painful reminder of their vulnerability. That evening, Thomas sat with his head in his hands, despair threatening to swallow him whole. Caleb walked to the main room, where Ethan was meticulously practicing his exercises. He watched the boy, his small hands gripping the crutches, his face a picture of grim determination. He then looked at Sarah, who was mending a torn shirt, her eyes red from quiet tears. "He's not just hurting you, Thomas," Caleb said, his voice quiet but firm. "He's hurting all of us. He's hurting Ethan. He's hurting Sarah. He's not just a man who wants land. He's a man who wants to break a family. We have to show him that he can't." "How, Caleb?" "He's got the town in his pocket. He's got the law on his side. He has influence, but we have something more powerful. We have the truth, and we have a community, even if they don't know it yet. I saw it on the faces of the people in town. They're afraid of him, but they're also tired of him." Caleb proposed a bold plan. They wouldn't fight Vance with bullets, but with proof. They would collect evidence of his crimes, the rustling, the sabotage, and they would present it to a higher authority, someone outside of Vance's sphere of influence. They needed someone who could stand up to Vance and his allies. They needed a U.S. Marshal. The idea was a long shot. It would take time, and in the meantime, their livelihood would continue to crumble. But it was their only option, a desperate, last-ditch effort to save their family and their land. Thomas, looking at his son's determined face, knew he had to try. He had hired a stranger, and now he was entrusting him with their last hope. The plan was set in motion. Thomas and Caleb would travel to the nearest federal courthouse, a journey of several days, to present their case to a U.S. Marshal. The ranch was left in Sarah's capable hands, with Ethan as her brave companion. The parting was filled with a quiet intensity. Sarah kissed Thomas goodbye, her eyes filled with both fear and resolve. Ethan clutched Caleb's leg, his small voice full of a courage far beyond his years. "Bring us back a marshal, Caleb," he said. The journey was long and grueling. The terrain was unforgiving and the heat was oppressive. Thomas and Caleb rode in silence for the most part, their thoughts their only companions. Thomas, a man of the land, was used to the solitude. But Caleb was a different kind of wanderer. He had no home, no destination, and Thomas realized with a pang that he was riding to a town that was just another stop on a long, solitary road. One night, sitting around a small campfire, Thomas finally broke the silence. "You don't have to do this, Caleb. You could have walked away a long time ago. My son is walking. You've done what you came to do." Caleb stoked the fire with a stick, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. "I made a promise, Thomas. Not just to you and Sarah, but to myself. This fight isn't just for your family. It's for every person who has been pushed around by a man like Silas Vance. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. And besides," he added with a slight smile, "I need to make sure I get my $2 back." The shared laughter was a rare moment of levity in the midst of their serious journey. It underscored the profound bond that had formed between them. They were no longer a desperate rancher and a wandering healer. They were partners, allies in a fight for justice. They reached the courthouse town, a sprawling, chaotic hub of commerce and law. They found the U.S. Marshal's office, a small, unassuming building with a star-emblazoned door. The marshal, a grizzled, no-nonsense man named Marshal Stone, listened to their story with a cynical eye. He had heard 1,000 stories of land disputes and petty feuds. He was not easily impressed. Thomas laid out the evidence: the cut-sluice gate, the stolen cattle, the veiled threats from Silas Vance. He spoke with a quiet passion, his words carrying the weight of a man who was fighting for his family's very existence. Marshal Stone listened, his expression unreadable. When Thomas was finished, the silence in the office was deafening. "Silas Vance is a powerful man," the marshal said, his voice a low rumble. "He has friends in high places. It's a he said situation. I need hard proof, something more than a rancher's word against a man with a reputation." Thomas's heart sank. He had known it was a long shot, but the marshal's words were a cold dose of reality. Caleb, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Marshal," he said, his voice steady, "you're right. We don't have hard proof. Not yet. But we have a story. A story of a man who lost his son and a boy who found a way to walk again. A story of a family that is being systematically destroyed by a man who thinks he is above the law. If you don't help, you're not just turning a blind eye to a land grab. You're turning a blind eye to a family's destruction." Caleb's words were not a plea, but an accusation. He was challenging the marshal to do his duty, to live up to the star on his chest. Marshal Stone looked at Caleb, then at Thomas, and saw not just a desperate rancher, but a man who was willing to risk everything to protect his family. He saw the truth in their eyes. "All right," the marshal said, a sigh escaping his lips. "I'll ride back with you. I can't promise anything, but I'll take a look, and I'll have a word with Vance. But if I don't find anything, you're on your own." The journey back was filled with a cautious hope. They had their ally, a man with the authority to face down Silas Vance. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Thomas felt like they had a chance. The arrival of Marshal Stone at the Sterling Ranch sent a ripple of tension through the small community. He was a symbol of federal power, a man who didn't take sides in local disputes, but who was obligated to uphold the law. His presence put Silas Vance on the defensive. Vance, a man who operated in the shadows, was now forced into the open. Marshal Stone spent the first day at the ranch, a silent observer. He walked the land with Thomas and Caleb, examining the places where the fences had been cut and the sluice gate had been tampered with. He listened to Sarah's account of the rustlers and the threats. He watched Ethan, who was now able to walk short distances with his crutches, his face a portrait of courage. The marshal said little, his face a stone mask. He was weighing the evidence, the word of a struggling rancher against the influence of a powerful land baron. He was a man who relied on facts, not on emotional pleas. The showdown came the next morning. Silas Vance, flanked by two of his hired hands, rode up to the Sterling Ranch. He was dressed in his finest clothes, his expression one of arrogant confidence. He saw Marshal Stone standing on the porch, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The smile on Vance's face faltered. "Marshal," Vance said, his voice slick, "I wasn't expecting you here. I'm just here to check on my old friend, Thomas." "Your old friend has filed a complaint against you, Vance," Marshal Stone said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "He claims you've been trespassing on his land, sabotaging his water supply and rustling his cattle." Vance laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Ridiculous. Thomas is a desperate man, Marshal. He's trying to hold on to a failing ranch. He's looking for someone to blame for his own failures. As for the cattle, a few of his wandered onto my land. I was just holding them for him." The lie was so blatant, so audacious, that it made Thomas's blood boil. He wanted to leap from the porch and confront Vance, but Caleb's hand on his shoulder held him back. "Thomas has an eyewitness," Caleb said, his voice calm and steady. "He saw your men, Vance. He saw them cutting the fence and pushing the cattle onto your land." Vance's eyes narrowed. He looked at Caleb, then at the two hired hands standing behind him. One of them, a burly, nervous-looking man, shifted uncomfortably. "And who is this man, Marshal?" Vance asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "A drifter? A man with no name, no reputation?" "He's Caleb Thorne," Marshal Stone said, "and he's standing right here." The tension was a palpable thing, a weight in the air that could be cut with a knife. Vance was in a corner, his carefully crafted lies crumbling around him. He had two choices, confess or fight. He chose to fight. With a silent nod to his men, he drew his pistol. His hired hands did the same. Thomas, Caleb, and the Marshal were ready, their hands on their own weapons. It was a classic Western standoff, the fate of the ranch and the justice of the community hanging in the balance. The climax was sudden and violent. A single gunshot rang out, and the fight was on. The gunshot echoed across the valley, a single sharp crack that shattered the tense silence. It was not Marshal Stone, nor Thomas, who fired. It was Caleb, his movements a blur of practiced speed. His shot was not at Vance, but at one of the hired hands, a grazing shot to the shoulder that made the man cry out and drop his gun. The sudden, unexpected action disoriented Vance and his other hired hand. The Marshal, a man of quick reflexes, used the distraction to his advantage. His pistol was out, and with a swift, economical movement, he disarmed the second hired hand. Vance, caught off guard, found himself staring down the barrel of Marshal Stone's gun. "It's over, Vance," the Marshal said, his voice cold and hard as steel. "Your bluff is called." Vance, his face pale with a mix of fury and fear, slowly lowered his weapon. The fight was over before it had even truly begun. The Marshal arrested Vance and his men, and as the dust settled, the magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. Thomas looked at Caleb, who simply reholstered his pistol, his expression calm. "You're a good shot, Caleb," Thomas said, a hint of awe in his voice. "Army surgeon," Caleb said with a small shrug. "You learned to be quick." The words were an understatement. Thomas had seen not just a quick hand, but a deep ingrained skill, a man who had faced down death 1,000 times and knew how to stand his ground. Marshal Stone, a man of few words, was impressed. He had seen hundreds of standoffs, and this one had been a masterclass in controlled aggression. He knew then that Thomas and Caleb were telling the truth. The Marshal and his prisoners rode away, leaving the Sterling family to a stunned silence. They had won. The threat was gone. The ranch was safe. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of triumph and relief, the family gathered on the porch. The day's events had been a whirlwind, a blur of violence and justice. But now, in the quiet, they could feel the weight of what they had endured. Ethan, his small hand holding Thomas's, looked at his father. "We won, Pa." "We did, son," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Caleb, and a silent conversation passed between them. The $2, the desperate plea, the unlikely friendship, it all came down to this moment, this quiet victory. Caleb simply nodded. He didn't need the credit. He had done what he had set out to do. He had helped a family, and in doing so, he had found a new kind of purpose. He was no longer just a wandering healer. He was part of something bigger, something real. With Silas Vance in jail, and the threat of legal action and sabotage gone, the Sterling Ranch began to heal. The community, seeing the truth of what had happened, came to their aid. Neighbors they had once thought had abandoned them came with tools and supplies, helping to mend the fences and clear the fields. The town's general store owner, Mr. Peterson, came with a new account, a gesture of apology and respect. The greatest healing, however, was in the Sterling household. Thomas, free from the weight of despair and the threat of ruin, was a different man. He was no longer a shadow of his former self, but a man of joy and gratitude. He worked on the ranch with a renewed purpose, his back straight, his eyes full of life. Sarah, her smile now a constant presence, tended to her family with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. And Ethan, the brave little boy who had endured so much, was making remarkable progress. The physical therapy was now a daily routine, a test of his own will and determination. The day came when Caleb felt it was time. He had been working with Ethan for months, and the boy's strength had returned. He could walk on his own, with the support of his crutches. But Caleb knew he had to let go. He had to give the family the space to heal on their own, to learn to stand on their own 2 feet. He found Thomas mending a fence near the horizon, the sun setting behind him in a blaze of gold and red. "I'm leaving, Thomas," Caleb said, his voice low. Thomas's hammer stilled. He had known this day would come, but it didn't make the words any easier to hear. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Don't know," Caleb said with a small smile. "Just walking, wherever the road takes me." Thomas walked to him, his eyes filled with a gratitude that words couldn't express. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, worn piece of paper. He had kept it all this time. It was the $2 he had offered Caleb on that desperate day. He handed it to him. "I don't need it, Thomas," Caleb said. "I know," Thomas said, "but I want you to have it, not as a payment, as a reminder of what a little hope can do, and of a family that will be forever grateful." Caleb looked at the $2, at the small, torn bill that had been the start of their journey. He took it, his hand closing around it. It wasn't about the money. It was about the gesture. It was a symbol of a promise kept, of a life saved, of a man who had been lost and found a way home, even if it was just for a little while. The day of Caleb's departure was a quiet one. He said his goodbyes to Sarah, who hugged him with tears in her eyes, and to Ethan, who gave him a hug that was filled with all the gratitude a small boy could muster. He mounted his horse, a solitary figure against the vast, empty landscape. Thomas stood on the porch, watching him go. He felt a pang of loss, a profound sense of sadness. Caleb had not just healed his son's body, he had healed his family's spirit. He had given them hope when they had none. Just as Caleb's horse was about to disappear over the horizon, a small voice called out, "Caleb!" Caleb turned his head. He saw Ethan standing in the middle of the yard, his hands empty. He wasn't leaning on crutches. He was standing on his own. Ethan, his face a mix of concentration and triumph, took a step, then another, and another. He wasn't walking perfectly, but he was walking. He was moving, not with the support of his crutches, but with the strength of his own 2 legs. Thomas watched, his heart swelling with a joy that was almost too much to bear. He looked at Caleb, and a silent conversation passed between them, a final, wordless goodbye. Caleb tipped his hat, a final gesture of respect and farewell. He watched the boy, the small, triumphant figure in the middle of the field, and a true, genuine smile spread across his face. He had come for a reason, and his job was done. He turned his horse and rode away, not as a broken man running from his past, but as a man who had found his purpose. He was still wandering, still a lone figure on a long road, but he was no longer lost. He had left behind not just a family, but a legacy of hope and resilience. The camera zooms out, showing the vast open land, the small ranch house, and the figure of a boy, a symbol of hope, walking on his own. The credits roll over the image of a man riding into the horizon, his journey far from over, but his purpose clear. The final scene shows a close-up of Caleb's hand as he rides, his fingers gently clutching the $2 he had refused to take. The money, a symbol of the desperate plea that had changed his life, was now a reminder that even the smallest gesture of hope can lead to the most impossible of victories.